And welcome to the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show, WNJC 1360 AM out of Washington Township, reaching Metro Philly. And my guest tonight is one I'm very excited to have back. He's a world-renowned political activist, a linguist, a cognitive scientist, a philosopher, author. He's MIT Professor Emeritus Noam Chomsky. Welcome to the show.
Good to be with you.
Now, we met earlier this month in Princeton. You were speaking with Amy Goodman at the Coalition for Peace event. And I wanted to start off asking you about one thing you talked about. You compared objectivity versus reality. Could you go into that a bit?
Well, I was using the term objectivity with a touch of irony. There is a concept of objectivity that's taught in journalism schools and that editors and journalists subscribe to, and they say so. Objectivity means reporting accurately what's going on inside the Beltway, within power circles. And if you report that accurately, then you're objective. If you discuss it or critically analyze it, that's subjective. If you talk about things that aren't discussed within the Beltway, that's biased and subjective. And in fact, it came up pretty recently. There was a little item. Do you know the group called Fairness and Accuracy in Media, FAIR? They have a journal called Extra, which is a journal of critical media analysis. They had an interesting little clip there where they quoted the editor the managing editor, some high figure in one of the main journals, the Washington Post or the New York Times, who was criticizing a writer, a reporter, because the writer had reported this famous speech of Paul Ryan's, which was just full of the most outrageous fabrications, and she commented on the fabrications and corrected them. And his point was, no, that's not what you're supposed to do. You're just supposed to report it objectively. And then they also quoted one of the main reporters for the New York Times, Ethan Brunner, who agreed. He said, yeah, that's our job, to be objective. So don't critically analyze what is said. That's for columnists. And don't report things that aren't discussed. And there's plenty that isn't discussed because it's outside the accepted framework of dominant doctrines. So that's the technique of objectivity. It's a mode of I wouldn't say censorship, but of molding the world so that it looks the way it's supposed to from the perspective of the powerful. The reality is what's actually happening out there. And objectivity and reality can be quite different. And
that really brings us to this whole challenge of the state of the media today. What's your take on where the media is now and where it could be?
Well, there's plenty to criticize about the media, but my own view is they're probably better than they were 40 or 50 years ago in this regard. The media, like the rest of the country, were influenced by the activism of the 1960s, which had quite a significant role in just civilizing the country on lots of issues. And that's had, first of all, a lot of the people in the media now, say reporters and others, have lived through those experiences. But it also generally changed the tenor of discussion of things. There's been a big regression and a reaction against it, but nevertheless it made significant and lasting changes. And that means that things are discussed now that were kind of off the spectrum years ago. So in some respects, I think the media have actually improved. But major issues remain. One of them is what we just were discussing. there's a strong tendency, in fact, an overwhelming one, even an ideology about keeping to the kinds of things that are discussed and debated within systems of power, and marginalizing things that are outside. That's very significant. In fact, both in domestic and international politics. So take domestic affairs. You read this morning's newspaper, a lead story in the New York Times about how difficult it's going to be to cut entitlements because people, which has to be done to deal with the deficit, because people are just resisting it. Well, there are things to be said about that, which aren't discussed within the Beltway. For one thing, for quite a long time and by large margins, the population, the general population, is pretty much across the board, all the way over to Tea Party people, think that the biggest problem that we face is a lack of jobs, that's much more important than the deficit. And in fact, I think they're right. I mean, even the business press agrees with that, and plenty of economists do. But the banks and financial institutions, investors, they're interested in the deficit. So therefore, that's the focus of attention. Almost all the discussion inside the Beltway, metaphorically, is about the deficit. We got to do something about the deficit. Although, in fact, I think the population is right. It is a relatively minor problem. Furthermore, if you're concerned about the deficit, you can also turn to public opinion and ask what people think about it. Well, they have opinions. For example, they've been well studied. The majority think we ought to cut military spending. We should sharply raise taxes on the rich, who are very much undertaxed. We should not touch so-called entitlements, Medicare and Social Security, in fact, strengthen them. And those are ways to deal with the deficit. That's almost the opposite of what's being discussed and proposed. And in fact, there's a further point which people don't discuss, probably because they don't know the facts. But the deficit, such as it is, could be overcome if we move to a rational healthcare system. The U.S. healthcare system is an international scandal. It's about twice the per capita costs of comparable countries and relatively poor outcomes. And the reason traces mostly to the fact, not entirely, but mostly to the fact that it's largely privatized and pretty much unregulated. And that leads to huge administrative expenses, expenses on other non-health expenses like advertising profits and so on. Leads to cherry picking, all kinds of things. So it's a highly inefficient system, and there's pretty good evidence. Some good economists have worked on this, especially Dean Baker, that if we move to just the kind of healthcare system that other industrial countries have, it would wipe out the deficit. Now, that's not discussed. And instead, what is being discussed is ways to make the system worse. So, for example, one of the proposals about cutting down healthcare costs is to raise the eligibility age for Medicare, say to a couple of years. Well, what does that do? That shifts people from a fairly efficient government-run program, Medicare, to a highly inefficient private program, much more expensive, namely private insurance. So that's a way of making the problem worse. Of course, it makes it look a little better from the point of view of the power system, because it shifts the cost from government to individuals. Individuals still paying more, just themselves, but the total healthcare expenses go up. These things just aren't discussed. You don't read about them in the media because they're not discussed within the Beltway, and they're opposed by major centers of power. I mean, for example, for a long time, there's been strong popular support, often majority support, large majority support, for some kind of national health care system. But when that's ever discussed, it was called politically impossible or something like that, meaning the big financial institutions don't like it. Well, that's on domestic issues, the major domestic issues. On international affairs, it's the same. Lots of critical things either are not discussed or are discussed with such through such a distorting lens that you just can't get a realistic picture of it. Well, this is part of almost the institutional structure of the media.
We have a media and a government and a political system that has become corporatized. It's more of a duopoly than separate different parties anymore. And there are a lot of people who see that we're almost, humanity is facing a looming collapse. In the Atlantic interview that you did with Yard and Katz, you talked about, was it an Atlantic interview? No, it was with Amy Goodman. You talked about how intelligence could be lethal. And I wonder, do you see a way out? Do you see a future for our economics that goes beyond the corporatist system that we have now? In any kind of an economy, whether it's capitalism or something else, that has light at the end of the tunnel for the middle class, for humanity even? You brought up the issue of intelligence being lethal in terms of global warming and how all these different leaders are making things worse rather than better.
Well, I don't recall the exact discussion, but if I was talking about intelligence being a lethal property, it was probably in the context of
Ernst Mayr, you
Ernst Mayr, yeah. Well, I was giving a kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek rendition of a discussion of his. He's maybe the grand old man of modern American biology, very important biologist. He had an interesting article once in which he pointed out that in terms of biological success essentially means how many are there around, In terms of biological success, he said the successful organisms are the least intelligent, ones that mutate rapidly like bacteria, or ones that have fixed ecological niches like beetles. They all do fine. And as you move up the scale of what we call intelligence, to mammals, to bigger mammals, to primates, and so on, you find less biological success. And he concluded that looking at it as a biologist, you could argue that intelligence is a lethal characteristic. And then I added to that the organisms that's considered at the peak of intelligence, namely us, is now engaged in the process of destroying itself and destroying everything else along with it, which would give the final touch to the theory. And that's what we're doing. I think I was referring specifically to environmental catastrophe. We don't have to do it, but we are doing it. And it's not because we're intelligent, it's because we've developed institutional structures which kind of drive us in that direction. So take, say, market systems. We don't really have market systems, but we have partially market systems. And in a market system has a built-in doomsday machine inside it. In a market system, you don't pay attention to what are called externalities. So, for example, effects on others. So, like if you sell me a car, let's say, if we're paying attention, we'll make a good deal for ourselves. You and I will both come out okay. But we don't bring into the calculation the effect of that sale on other people. And there's an effect. There's another car on the road, there's more pollution, there's more congestion, there's a greater chance of accidents, and so on. And magnified over a lot of people, that can be a big effect. Well, that's inherent in the nature of market systems, unless they somehow internalize externalities, in which case they're not really market systems. Now, when you get to the that's just an individual transaction. But you think about it in terms of bigger institutions, like, say, banks and investment firms, say Goldman Sachs. When they make a transaction, say a risky loan or something like that, they take into account the effects on them. Will the profits overcome the risk and so on? But they don't take into account what's called systemic risk. That is the chance that if the loan goes bad and they're in trouble, the whole system may crash. Yeah, they don't take that into account. That's not part of the calculation. Well, that's a significant part of what lies behind the regular financial crashes, increasingly severe ever since deregulation set in. Now, if you go a step higher than that, and you're, say, the CEO of some Exxon Mobil or something, your job is to maximize profit and market share. You don't take into account the fact that there's an externality, the fate of the species. You just don't calculate that in. And that's true for non-energy corporations too. Trying to maximize profit, you don't take into account the impact on the fate of the species. And that's no joke now. We're reaching a point in human existence where the fate of the species is indeed in danger. And one major reason for it is just that it's not a calculation that's made within market systems. Well, we don't really have, we only have qualified market systems, but to the extent that they function, this is a built-in doomsday machine. And there are many. Now
you're talking about economics, really. Now, in your interview with Yard and Katz in the Atlantic, you talked about how whatever the science, you need to learn the fundamental science that's going to be applicable, whatever comes along next. You talk about that with engineering, needing physics, with medicine, needing biology. What do you think the state of economics is? Because isn't that really the science that marketing is based upon?
Well, economics is not like physics and biology. I mean, economics is, it's an interesting field. Economists do a lot of interesting things, but to a significant extent, economic theory is studying abstract systems that have only a limited relationship to what goes on in the world. That's one reason why overwhelmingly professional economists didn't notice or didn't think it was important that we're entering into a huge housing bubble. I mean, through the last 10 years until it crashed, until it burst, housing prices were going way beyond any basis in economic fundamentals. But economists were so captivated by concepts like efficient market hypotheses and so on that they didn't think it was important or didn't even notice it. Well, that's a dramatic, and then the whole thing crashed, and in fact, a lot of the foundations of economic theory crashed. But that's a reflection of the fact that though the fields are, not denigrating the fields, a lot of important work, nevertheless, there's respects in which they're quite far from the sciences, many respects, which is not surprising. Economic systems are a lot more complex than big molecules.
And you've talked about complexity and systems. You talk about how if you're really going to study anything, you've got to look at how systems are highly modular and that the different parts function differently. Yet you also talk, and I'll quote you, unification is kind of an intuitive ideal, part of the scientific mystique, if you like. It's that you're trying to find a unified theory of the world. Now, maybe there isn't one. Maybe different parts work in different ways, but your assumption is, until I'm proven wrong, definitively, I'll assume that there's a unified account of the world, and it's my task to try to find it. And it seems what you're describing in the problems with markets where all these levels leave out the big effects on the whole system, that it is a unified theory that needs to be addressed.
Well, let me just make a comment. That the passages you're quoting are about the hard sciences. They're about basic physics and chemistry. and maybe biology. And it's there that the problems of unification that I was discussing arise. When you move up to social systems, market systems, and others, it's so complex and there's so many variables and so little is understood that you can barely raise these questions.
But wouldn't that be the long-term vision? You know, frankly, Dr. Chomsky, I see you as a big thinker as well as somebody who knows the minutiae. So I'm asking you questions that are big questions, really, because it seems to me like it applies.
Well, you cannot, the kinds of questions that were being discussed in the passage you quoted about unification, it really had to do with things like how early 20th century chemistry related to quantum theory. Now, that's way beyond anything we can discuss in the case of social systems and human life. We might hope that someday we'll understand enough about really, really complex issues to be able to raise these questions, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to raise them now. I mean, take even, you quoted my saying that, say, engineers should be studying basic physics. But remember the context of that comment. I was pointing out changes that have taken place in the 20th century, in my lifetime. In fact, even during my professional career, I was pointing out that when MIT is the premier, engineering science school in the world, maybe, or certainly one of them. When I got here in the 1950s, there were a very excellent physics and math departments, really good ones, but they were essentially providing services to the engineers, teaching them tricks they could use. Engineers were still, at that time, the 1950s, the engineering profession was very largely based on craftsmanship, an artisan's knowledge, skill, experience, the kind of thing that makes a good carpenter. So students were learning how to build things, make them, and so on, using that kind of background. Now, by the 1960s, 10 years later, the curriculum had significantly changed. And instead of studying, how you build circuits or build a bridge or something like that, students in just about every engineering department were studying basic physics and basic chemistry. And there were several reasons for that. One reason was that there were major advances in science and technology during that period. And in fact, one effect was that if you wanted to do serious engineering, you'd better understand basic physics because it was now becoming directly applicable. And also, technology was beginning to change very quickly. So being trained in the technology of today may not be of much help 10 years from now. So it's best to understand the basic science that lies behind it, and you'll be equipped to deal with the changes. But that's a very recent change. It's a couple of decades ago. And this is in the most advanced disciplines. Pretty much the same was true of medicine. I mean,
what level do you think economics and marketing are at compared to?
Not even in the same ballpark. I mean,
you talk about pre-Copernican.
All of it. Look, it's not a criticism. The reason why physics and chemistry make significant progress is that they're dealing with artificially simple systems. So physics makes huge progress because it really isn't dealing with what's going on in the outside world. Like physicists don't take videotapes of what's happening in the outside world and try to construct physics from it. It's concerned with extremely simple systems understood within the highly abstract context of sophisticated experiments. And doing that, you can make really enormous progress, tremendous intellectual achievements. But if a physicist gets to say a molecule that's too complicated, they hand it over to chemists. And if it becomes too complicated for the chemists, they hand it over to the biologists. And if it's too complicated to them, they hand it over to the historians or sociologists. As you move up to, and of course, as you move to higher and higher levels of complexity, you quite naturally get less and less fundamental understanding. That's almost automatic. So it's not that a deep understanding is inconceivable. It's just going to be a lot harder. And when we talk about those issues of unification that you were quoting in connection with the sciences, or the shift from teaching engineering to teaching basic science, remember that's very recent, after literally thousands of years of intensive study and progress.
And you mentioned in that same article, and frankly, that article grabbed me because my first encounter with you was back in the early 70s as a psychology major, reading about psycholinguistics. And so I think of you not just as an activist, but of course as a scientist. And you mentioned in that article, at some point, and I quote, "At some point in human evolution, and it's apparently pretty recent given the archaeological record, maybe the last 100,000 years, a computational system emerged which had new properties that other organisms didn't have. It has kind of arithmetical type properties." Now, you were talking about language acquisition skills there, I think.
Yeah.
Right? And there are people...
Go ahead. Sorry.
Just to wrap up the question. Others have written about how small changes in language, like the onset of writing or the beginning of the Gutenberg press, have had like people like Leonard Shlain and Walter Ong. They've explored how these changes have had major effects on how people function in our culture. I'm just curious where now we have the internet and it's massively changing things. I really think that it had a big effect on the Occupy Wall Street phenomenon. And I'm asking you, so we go from 100,000 years ago, the computational system emerges, and arithmetical brain properties, and language, and writing, and now we have the internet. Where do you see us all moving with this as humans?
Well,
we don't fill ourselves with our intelligence.
Well, I think we have to be careful not to mix apples and oranges. The emergence of language, and with it, apparently, other properties of cognitively modern humans, us, basically, that's probably within, could be maybe roughly around 75,000 years ago, plus or minus some. But there hasn't been any change since then. We're the same humans we were then. In fact, we know pretty well with high confidence that for at least roughly 50,000 years, there's been no evolution, no detectable evolution of human cognitive capacities. The way we know this is quite straightforward. If you take an infant from a tribe in the Amazon, which hasn't had the contact, which has been isolated from other humans for 10,000 years or whatever, and you bring that infant to say New York City, it'll be just like a kid growing up in New York. It'll speak the same way. It'll go to MIT and study quantum theory and so on. And conversely, you take an infant from New York and put them in that tribe in the Amazon, it'll be like the other children there. Well, that tells us that they have essentially the same cognitive capacities. Now, there are individual differences, not very large, but some in cognitive capacities, and of course there's pathology at the extremes, but there are really no known group differences. And from that, we learned that evolution of human language and other, as far as we know, other cognitive capacities just hasn't taken place, or at least at most is, very marginal for at least 50,000 years since humans began to leave Africa, maybe 75,000 years. I mean, the numbers are kind of indefinite, but something on that order. So yes, something apparently quite sudden happened from an evolutionary point of view, roughly in the 50 to 100,000 year time window. You can double the numbers if you like, nothing changes. From an evolutionary point of view, that's the flick of an eye. So something sudden happened. It led to cognitively modern humans, and they really haven't changed since then. Now, the other things you're talking about don't involve evolutionary change. So no change in the genes, no change in the way our brains are organized in any significant way. But there are changes, and there are big ones, like the internet is undoubtedly a big change. But the fact of the matter is that the invention of the printing press was a much bigger change, or it takes a speed of communication. I mean, communication is much faster now than it was, say, 10 years ago. But the shifts in the last generation are very slight as compared to the shifts a century earlier. I mean, the shift, say, from sailing ships to telegraph was dramatically greater than the shift from, telephones to iPads or whatever they are, or to the internet. I mean, a shift from the sailing ship to a telegraph meant that instead of a letter to England waiting maybe 2 months for an answer, it could be almost instantaneous. The development of the printing press had a huge effect on human life, I think greater than the current ones. So these changes that are taking place are significant. And you're right about the internet and the Occupy movement. In fact, activist movements, they constantly use the internet for organizing. These are all important developments. And the same with the kinds of things that Walter Wrong and others are talking about. But they are not changes in human capacity. They are not evolutionary changes. So they're quite different than whatever it was that took place that led to cognitively modern humans with human language and other cognitive capacities.
Along these same lines, I've been wrestling with the idea of civilization itself. There are a couple people who are saying that civilization is unsustainable the way it is. And I believe that we're transitioning from a world that is what civilization created, that is hierarchical and top-down and centralized, to a more bottom-up, decentralized world. And it seems to me that started with the onset of agriculture, when humans transitioned from being hunter-gatherers to becoming farmers, domesticators of animals, and then the builders of cities and what became civilization. It seems to me like the way it evolved to now, where civilization has become a corporatist state, we don't have a great looking future. Do you have any ideas about this transition of humans from hunter-gatherer forager to civilization and where we are now in civilization?
Well, probably 95% of human history is hunter-gatherers. The agricultural revolution was very recent, roughly 10,000 years ago. The formation of city-states came a couple of thousand years later, and the corporatization that you're talking about is, last century or so. So almost all of human history is hunter-gatherers. And those societies, many of which still exist around the world, tend to be relatively egalitarian. And, I mean, there are plenty of complexity to them, but they don't have the kinds of hierarchies and authoritarianism and centralization that took place with the development of cities wasn't true in those days. There's some debate about this among anthropologists, but I think the weight of evidence shows that just war in the modern sense developed pretty much with city-states. Hunter-gatherer societies, they might have some fighting, but there's nothing like war. Contrary to a lot of stuff in the literature, there's pretty good evidence of this. And now when you talk about our corporate society, you're talking about advanced Western societies. That's not most of the world. Maybe they're moving in that direction, maybe not. But and it has self-destructive features in it, some of which we've discussed. can they be overcome and replaced by more cooperative systems based on democratic participation, mutual support, and so on? You know, that's possible. In fact, I agree with you. That's what we should be working for. But you just can't predict how far it'll go. These are matters for action, not for speculation. And there are signs of it. Yes.
Now, in your interview with Amy Goodman, America in Decline, you talked about America being in decline, and then you get into the idea of how one of the main things America has done is block democracy in developing states and nations. The Vietnam War, you say the Vietnam War was fought primarily to ensure that an independent Vietnam would not develop successfully to become a model for other countries in the kingdom, in the region. And then you talk about how in the last 10 years, South American countries have begun to develop independence and a degree of integration. And the Arab Spring is another such a threat, you said, that threatens to take that big region out of the grand arena. It's a lot more significant than Southeast Asia or South America. And that so far the Arab Spring has been pretty well contained. And you said this, and I quote, "We managed to ensure that the threat of democracy would be smashed in the most important place." In Egypt, the United States followed a standard operating procedure when one of your favorite dictators gets into trouble. Now, that's really interesting. The U.S. has a standing operating procedure when one of its dictators gets in trouble. Could you describe that?
Well, it's happened so many times it takes real effort not to see it. So take, say, Somoza, just in recent years, Somoza in Nicaragua. That was the Carter administration. They supported, which is, maybe the most human rights-oriented administration. They supported Somoza right to the end. After he had killed, his troops had literally killed maybe 40,000 people. U.S. continued to support him when the business world turned against him. It was going to be impossible to support him any longer. The Carter administration tried to rescue the remnants of the regime, even rescue the hated National Guard, and move them elsewhere, and then try to reconstitute them. And then Reagan came along, essentially reconstitute them as a force to overthrow the new government. That's Somoza. A couple of years later, Duvalier in Haiti, another favorite dictator, came under internal threat. Again, the U.S. supported him. This is Reagan now to the bitter end. Finally, the army turned against him, and then the Reagan administration flew him out of the country with half the country's treasury in his plane, on an Air Force plane, to Paris. Marcos in the Philippines, about the same time, same story. Mobutu in the Congo, Suharto in Indonesia. This is just routine. If you have a favorite dictator, support him as long as possible. If it becomes impossible, send him off somewhere and essentially try to reconstruct the old system. That's pretty much what happened in Egypt. The Obama administration supported Mubarak to the very end, practically the last minute. Finally, even the army turned against him, and they realized they got to ditch him, so they sent him off to Sharm el-Sheikh, and since then have been trying to reconstruct a regime that would somehow follow the same neoliberal policies. They don't control, they don't control everything, but that's certainly what they're trying to influence. And in the countries that really matter to the West, the oil dictatorships, that the U.S. has supported, the dictatorships have very harshly repressed any significant effort at reform, and the U.S. has backed them all the way. France did the same in Tunisia, which was, its dependency. They supported the dictator Ben Ali up to the point where it's becoming a joke, even after people were wildly demonstrating in the streets. But that's exactly the way powerful systems act. Shouldn't surprise us. No system of power wants democracy. It's a threat to its interests. I mean, of course, they'll talk about democracy, but, everybody talks about democracy. Stalin talked about it. The Japanese fascists talked about it. Everyone says democracy is great. But systems of power are not going to like it because it erodes their power. I mean, it's as simple as that. And the evidence for it is just overwhelming. Incidentally, there's also scholarly discussion of it by people who are considered, by major scholars who are considered to regard themselves as strongly in favor of democracy promotion. I've written about the scholarship, I can say about it. But the basic conclusion, which shouldn't surprise anyone, is that the United States supports democracy if and only if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives. I mean, you got to be pretty naive to expect anything different. And the fact that it's clearly established by scholarly work, even scholarly work that doesn't like the outcome, but honest work, that's good, but shouldn't surprise us. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I've got to take off. I've got another interview online.
Okay, thank you so much. The one question I had left for you was about Gaza. Yeah. You got a minute for Gaza?
Yeah. Go ahead. I just came back from there,
Yeah, I know. So what is your take on what's happening there? I know that there's a new balance taking place and that you've got Qatar is now giving money, which is changing the balance with not just Iran funding them. Where do you see things happening and going there? What should we be doing?
Well, first of all, the punishment of Gaza has been going on since 1948. 1948, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians either were expelled or fled in terror from what's now Israel. In fact, Israel was still trucking them across the border years after the ceasefire. After 1967, there was a new, then Israel conquered Gaza, there was a new expulsion of refugees. The goal at the time, we know this from internal records, was just drive them all out of Gaza. Well, they couldn't quite do that, but they sent out plenty in violation and wouldn't let them return in violation of Security Council resolutions, and even worse in the West Bank. Since then, it's been a constant a record of violence and repression. The most recent period of severe repression by the U.S. and Israel, they worked together, is since 2006. There was a free election, carefully monitored free election in January 2006, actually the first one in the Arab world, the only one really. And the U.S. didn't like the way it came out, nor did Israel. They wanted it to come out a different way. So they immediately turned to harsh punishment of the people of Gaza, of Palestine altogether, which is a nice indication of how much they love democracy. It's got to turn out the right way. Well, the U.S. also turned to another standard operating procedure when you don't like a government, organize a military coup to overthrow it. Okay, that military coup was beaten back a year later, and the elected government took over, Hamas government. At that point, the punishment of Gaza got far more extreme, both by Israel and the U.S., with European Union tailing along. Then came this hideous Operation Cast Lead, which is just a mass murder operation. And so it continues. This is just the latest upsurge, the last month. If you read the ceasefire accords, a brief statement, it says that within 24 hours after the cessation of hostilities, the major fundamental issues like the siege, and which is an act of war, of course, and the barring of constraints on people entering and leaving and so on, that'll all be addressed. Well, nothing's being addressed, and so this is the main story. The primary story is that the U.S. and Israel have been and are continuing to maintain a harsh regime of punishment and siege in Gaza, while at the same time they're pretty much taking over what's of value to them in the West Bank and separating Gaza and the West Bank from one another in direct violation of the Oslo Accords. Those are the major issues. There's a lot of minor.
Now, you're
ones.
Jewish. I'm Jewish. I hear from Jewish people I know all the time, oh, Israel treats the people in Gaza good. They bring them to Deborah Hospital. And what else could Israel do with all those bomb raining down on them? What is your reply to that? And what did you see when you were there in Gaza? What do you have to report from your actual visit there?
Well, I wrote about it, so you can look it up. But it's basically a prison. Okay. It's people are imprisoned. The Israeli policy is to prevent them from starving to death. That wouldn't look good, but essentially prevent development. So, like at the start, just to give you one indication, at the beginning of this latest Israeli upsurge of violence, November 14th, about half of the essential medicines required in Gaza were not available. They weren't there. That's because of the siege. Yeah, that's you go to visit hospitals. They don't have simple medicines. They don't have surgical equipment. There's very little construction because Israel won't allow real construction to take place except in limited ways. The idea that they let them in the hospitals is a joke. They actually bar going to hospital. Occasionally they'll let somebody in. The question, what should you do when you're under attack by missiles, is a fair question. And there are answers, very straightforward answers. One answer, a simple one, is to accept a truce. There were constant truce offers right before this latest upsurge too. There was another one before Cast Lead. And during the truces, we know from Israeli official sources, Hamas observed the truce completely. Like the pre-Cast Lead truce, there wasn't a single Hamas missile fired until Israel broke the truce. So one simple answer is accept a truce. Another simple answer is follow the principles of international law, which are quite clear. You can read the UN Charter. It's very explicit. Force is permitted under one circumstance, unless authorized by the Security Council. One circumstance. If a country thinks it's under armed attack, it's supposed to notify the Security Council, and it's allowed to use force in self-defense until the Security Council acts. That's the one exception. Well, Israel, of course, didn't do that because it knew that if it approached the Security Council, the whole array of pretexts would fall apart. But that's the second answer. And there's a third answer, a much more significant one. Actually, by interesting coincidence, one of the conservative national security journals just published an article about it, not referring to Israel. They were referring to China. In China, in the western province, Xinjiang province, there was an uprising, and the Uyghur population started slaughtering Han Chinese. Well, if it had been Israel or the United States, we know how they would have reacted. But China reacted differently. The prime minister flew there. Security officials were removed. Policies were introduced to deal with the underlying problems, development, reconstruction, and so on, and the violence reduced. That's the more far-reaching approach. The U.S. and Israel should be paying extensive reparations to Gaza for what they've been doing to them for the last, far back as you want to go, so at least 48. Well, so there are answers. It's a fair question, and there are answers to it. Sorry, I've really got to leave. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. This is the Rob Kall Bottom Up Radio Show. I've been speaking with Noam Chomsky, a legend in activism in the left.